The Atari 5200. Most people know it as a major failure in Atari's catalog, but is it worth all of that infamy? Let's find out. In this video, we'll be listing out the many issues that the 5200 has and talking about whether or not they're a big deal. Next time, we'll take a look at the 5200 and how it stacked up with its competition. So let's get into it. In our previous video on the ColecoVision, I casually brought up the Atari 5200, a console which I described as being, and I quote, one of the worst consoles of all time. This sparked a whole lot of debate in the comments from people calling that an unfair criticism, and those ranting about how much they hated their 5200s they had as kids. So I figured it was time to take a deep dive into the 5200 to look at its history, find out why it was a failure, and end the debate on whether or not it was a bad system. So we picked up a rather expensive 5200 lot from a collector in the Chicago area that came with a ton of games. Now let's give this thing a deep analysis, like it deserves. Atari was riding high in the 1970s. They had essentially invented the modern video game industry thanks to the success of Pong, other arcade machines they created, and their home video game console, the Atari Video Computer System. I've talked in depth before about how great this system is. You can watch that video here, but you should know quite a bit already since it is one of the most iconic systems of all time. Atari was worried that the success of their console would be short-lived. That's humorous today since we do know how long the lifespan of the VCS would stretch, but Atari saw it as a fad product. Surely people would get bored of it by 1979 or 1980, just like they had gotten bored of Pong systems. So Atari's plan was to develop a brand new game console, to release somewhere around 1980 that would be light years ahead of anything on the market. This prototype would lead to some strange places. This new system they were designing would have much better graphics and sound options than the 2600, while also using a more standard CPU, allowing for easier game development. But, you see, in the late 70s, the home computer market was just beginning to explode in popularity. Atari realized that this new console they were designing could easily be transformed into a computer platform that would stand above the rest in graphical capabilities. And being a computer instead of a console would help justify the cost of the new technology. So the prototype became the Atari 400 and 800, the first computers of what is now called the Atari 8-bit line. They sold fairly well, beginning with their 1979 release. It was a pretty smart move, but then everything changed, with the release of Mattel's Intellivision in test markets for Christmas of 1979. All of a sudden, the Intellivision threat had Atari really worried. There was now a system on the market more powerful than theirs, and it was selling well with a lot of buzz. And Atari had nothing to put up against it. Atari decided that the best move would be to dust off their original console prototype, give it a modern look and some cool new tech, and sell it as soon as possible, which turned out to be 3 years later with a 1982 release. So Atari ended up taking their next generation home super console and building it off of a 6-year-old specification. That sounds like a bad idea on paper, but with the Atari 8-bit platform being several years ahead of its competition, it really wasn't an issue. So here it is, their brand new system, given the space-age name, the Atari 5200. Retroactively, the Atari VCS would be renamed to the Atari 2600 to fall in line with the new branding, a choice that has never confused anyone ever. You'll see that the 5200 has a very striking appearance. First off, it's huge. It's a massive console, but a lot of that footprint comes from the empty space of the controller holding shelf in the back. It also looks quite modern with its black design with silver accent. I really like that look. You'll notice the 4 controller ports on the front of our 5200, something pretty unique for the time. Not all 5200s have them. Some later 5200 models only have 2 controller ports, and some other minor changes. Generally, the 4-port models are rarer since they were sold at the beginning of the system's life when the system was more expensive, but it really doesn't matter all that much which model you pick up. Now's the point of the video where we need to discuss the problems of the 5200. Let's go over the major problems individually. Issue 1. The controller. This is probably the most well-known issue with the 5200, the infamously bad controller. Now, the 5200 having a bad controller is nothing special for the time. Both the Intellivision and ColecoVision also launched with controllers that many people consider awful, but none were criticized quite like the 5200. The concept of the 5200 controller is clearly a part of the Intellivision paranoia Atari was filled with during the design process. It copies the Intellivision's basic layout of having a number pad and side-firing buttons, as was the style at the time. And what's better than a spinning control disc? A spinning control disc that's also a joystick. And this is the main point of contention with the 5200. The analog joystick. The analog joystick might seem like something mundane to us now that we are used to having 2 with every single controller under the sun, but it was a new technology Atari had dumped wheelbarrows of research money into developing. It was a great marketing tool as well. Featuring the unique tech of the controller helped to sell it as a high-tech device of the future. I mean, come on, it had a pause button! There's just one problem. This controller here, it's really bad. The primary issue with the controller is that it uses a non-centering stick, which means if you push the control stick in a specific direction, it won't snap back to a resting position in the center. Instead, it will just sit where you left it. It's also quite hard to find the dead zone of the controller. Sometimes you'll think that the controller is in the center, not moving anything, then you'll die because it was actually leaning slightly to the right. This control style works really well with a few games, like Missile Command, where it works like an on-screen cursor, but most games of the time were arcade games that required quick, snappy movement, something this controller just isn't good at. Like, it makes Pac-Man complete garbage. The other issue with the controller is durability. This wasn't a major issue at release, but in order to get all of the new tech into the 5200 controller at a reasonable cost, some corners were cut. Looking at the controller now, I can tell you that you absolutely will not find one that is in working condition without being completely repaired, replacing the flex circuit board, fixing the buttons, and removing the now deteriorating foam from the inside. Very, very few 5200 controllers out there in the wild still work, so if you pick up a bundle, expect to spend some extra money on repair parts from one of many eBay sellers or directly from Best Electronics, if you're willing to sift through a website nearly as old as the 5200 itself. Unfortunately, the biggest issue here is that you can't just plug in a better controller. The 5200's controller was so advanced that Atari couldn't use the 9-pin game port that they themselves popularized, which locks the 5200 out of most third-party controller offerings. Most. Issue 2. Brittle Plastic. Another issue with the 5200 that really is only an issue for us modern collectors with aging systems is brittle plastic, particularly the translucent smoky parts. It's quite hard to find a 5200 without some scratches at the least, or more likely, little broken bits. This especially is something you want to pay attention to while cleaning the system, which in itself is quite the task. Issue 3. Disassembly. And this is really a personal gripe, but seriously, the 5200 is the worst system ever when it comes to cleaning. Our system arrived in pretty great condition, so when I went to clean it, to get some nice shots of it for this video, I thought it would take, like an hour, try 3 days. The primary reason it is so difficult to clean lies with the grills all over the system. They like to collect dust like nothing else I've ever seen. These things get so dusty on the inside, it's ridiculous. So you have to deal with the cleaning out of dozens upon dozens of hard to access slots all over the console, but also doing that while trying not to break the thing. Then there's the second challenge inside the system, the RF shield. This thing uses bent pins to keep it secured on the motherboard. You're going to hate the process of removing it. It's nearly impossible to get off without damaging it, even that takes some time. It can also be really sharp in some places, so make sure you are caught up on your tetanus shots. Many 5200 owners choose to permanently remove this shield from the console, so it can save some time when they have to work on it inevitably in the future when it breaks again. It's annoying. Enough said. Rant over. Don't at me. Issue 4. Price. The Atari 5200 launched at a rather expensive price point at $269. In comparison, many other video game consoles were available for much cheaper. If you wanted to spend that much money, you had computers going down in price drastically over the time frame that the 5200 was on sale, making them a much more appealing purchase. Issue 5. 8-bit Incompatibility. The Atari 5200 and the Atari computer line share the same origins, being based off of the same prototype. Both platforms are physically nearly identical, using the same chip designs. You would expect them to be fully compatible. You should be able to just insert an Atari 8-bit game in the 5200 cartridge port and play it, but no, they are completely incompatible. Was this for some vital function of the 5200 that just couldn't be done on the computers? Was this to prevent a Commodore 64 GS press any key situation? No. The primary reason is really stupid. Corporate politics. You see, the 5200 was strong competition for Atari itself. There was a large rivalry between the video game division of Atari and the home computer division of Atari. Each was worried the other would be so successful that they themselves would be absorbed. As such, the two divisions did everything they could to steer clear of each other, including intentionally making their devices incompatible with each other's. While games were not directly compatible between the two, porting from one to the other was really easy, making it relatively easy for Atari and the major third-party publishers of the 8-bit line to have a presence on the 5200, but it was way less easy for small publishers. That's the main reason the 5200's game library is what it is. The 5200 was overall a riskier system to release games on than most of the other devices on the market, especially the 2600 itself, which had a massive install base still hungry for games. This means only the big publishers who could afford the gamble published on the 5200. This makes the 5200 library one of the smallest of its generation, with only 69 official game releases. Not nice. With over half of those titles being released by Atari themselves. A consequence of this is that, well, with titles being filtered down like that to only the major releases from major publishers, the stuff that will actually turn a profit, we have a library that is, yes, small, but also extremely high quality. There are so many good arcade ports on the 5200. My personal favorite 5200 games are the decent port of Mario Bros., the surprisingly faithful Miss Pac-Man, and the graphically impressive Ball Blazer. With a library that small, you would think Atari would prioritize letting people play the hundreds of pre-existing 2600 games on their new console. But no. Which brings us to Issue 6, 2600 Compatibility. Another compatibility issue experienced by 5200 owners was that it didn't play 2600 games. Atari overlooked the value of letting consumers play their old games on their new console. The concept of backwards compatibility didn't really exist yet. This was particularly embarrassing since both the ColecoVision and Intellivision had expansion devices that allowed them to play 2600 games, allowing them to better capitalize on consumers looking to upgrade systems than Atari themselves. Atari would rectify the situation by releasing their own expansion device in 1983 alongside the new 2-port 5200 model, but by then the damage was already done. The device itself is quite odd. With a wedge-shaped device, it slots directly into the 5200's cartridge slot. It kind of reminds me of the Sega 32X in its design. It overall didn't sell very well, making it quite a rare expensive item today, and since it's my least favorite of the 3 2600 expansion devices from the time, I can't really recommend you pick one up. Okay, so those are all of the primary issues people have with the Atari 5200. Some of these are issues that have only really become issues to modern collectors. Others are issues that have been around since the beginning. Join me next time as we compare the Atari 5200 to its competition, the many other consoles and computers available at the time that probably swayed people's business from the 5200. Until then, please make sure to like this video, comment down below what you think of the Atari 5200. Do you think its infamy is not quite deserved? Do you think people should give it a better chance? Also, make sure to join our Patreon so you can support us buying systems that need tons of repairs like this 5200. And if you'd like to talk with me and a ton of other retro video game nerds, you can join our Discord server. And I'll see you guys next time.